Is the United States an imperialist power? That's a pretty loaded question, huh? Well, stay tuned as we study the history of US intervention in the Caribbean around 1900. In the previous videos, we studied the history of European imperialism in the 19th century, in places like the Belgian Congo, French Algeria, or British India. Would the term imperialism apply to the United States as well? Well, if you had asked the question to a 19th century American, they would have been very offended. The United States was not an imperial power, they would tell you. This was actually a former colony. It was born out of a revolt against imperialism. Sure, the United States had invaded territories held by Native Americans and then taken over the northern half of Mexico in the early 19th century, but that was just the manifest destiny of the United States to go from sea to shining sea. These were just mostly empty territories. Well, if you look at the map of the Caribbean and the Pacific in the late 19th and early 20th century, you'll notice quite a few US territories, anywhere from Hawaii to the Philippines to Cuba to Puerto Rico to Panama. So maybe there is something to be said about US imperialism in the region. So what would be the basic ideological framework? For that, we have to go back to James Monroe, the president, in 1823 when he issued the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine is a bit inspired by George Washington's notion of non-entanglement in European affairs. The notion was to stay out of what was going on in Europe, but also to protect Latin America from potential European interference. This was right after the time that many Latin American countries got independence. The fear was that Spain or other colonial powers would come in and take over those territories and recolonize them. So Monroe, using a kind of an idealistic statement that this Western Hemisphere would be open for democracy only and independence, warned European powers not to intervene in Latin America, that these areas would be remaining free at least from European interference. This Monroe Doctrine, as it became known, became the basis for all future US policy in the region all the way to the present time. It was seen by the United States as a very idealistic statement, not liked quite as much in Latin America. For one thing, Latin Americans were never consulted on the matter. And they also noticed that this meant that the Western Hemisphere would be free from European imperialism, but the doctrine said nothing about preventing the United States from invading those countries. So there's a bit of a division of the world going on there. Europe can invade Africa, Asia. We keep Latin America as our own backyard. That doctrine is often coupled with a corollary to that doctrine, named after Teddy Roosevelt and issued in 1904. During that period, many countries in Latin America were subjected to a lot of political upheavals, and so that led European powers to want to intervene simply so that they could collect the debts that Latin American countries had defaulted on. So Roosevelt was afraid that this instability would encourage Europeans to intervene and save Venezuela, thus violating the doctrine. So Roosevelt added something to the doctrine, and that's what a corollary is, and that would be that the United States would intervene first so that Europeans would not have to do it. Often it's described as the US acting as policemen of Latin America. So if Venezuela defaults on debts to European banks, or you have local upheavals that threaten assets held by European companies, well, the United States will first intervene, pacify the country, collect the debts, pay off the debts, and this way no other countries would have to do it. So the United States intervened quite a bit in the late 19th century. What is the interest, you might say? What is the motive for the United States to intervene so much in that area? Well, typically in US foreign policy, you see three main things at play. One aspect would be the pursuit of profit. One would be the defense of US national security interest. And one would be idealism. And all three of them you can see combined during the period in late 19th, early 20th century. Roughly, they would correspond to three major presidents: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. These are the ones, along with William McKinley, that intervened the most in that general area. So let's start with the pursuit of national security interests. What is it that is so important about the Caribbean, tiny islands here and there, to the security of the US? Well, for one thing, it's just proximity. If Germany or any other power gains a foothold in the Caribbean, it could directly threaten the US. Also, this is a sea with passages and straits and a canal eventually, so it has a lot of importance to the US Navy. a key thinker in the US Navy back then was a man called Alfred T. Mahan. He was a naval historian, naval Naval, as in historian of the Navy, nothing to do with the history of my belly button, and not a very good navigator, so I think he was assigned short side in Annapolis to just train young cadets about the history of the Navy of the United States. And he wrote a big book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, which is essentially a world history, what I do, except through the prism of the Navy. And his big theory is whoever controls the seas becomes a world power. Why is it that Spain became the big power of the 16th century? Because they had explorers, because they had galleons, and because they controlled the Atlantic. And then they were supplanted by the Dutch when the Dutch developed a strong navy, and they themselves were beaten up by the British and the French because they had a stronger navy. You get the idea. Mahan, being an American patriot, wanted the United States to be the next great world power, and the recipe is obvious, and that would be, well, build up the navy, control sea lanes, take up ports, colonies overseas. That's the recipe. One of the readers of Mahan would be Theodore Roosevelt, who also became convinced that developing the American Navy would be key. And as president, he always asked for greater appropriations for the Navy and sent the American fleet on a worldwide tour to kind of flex his muscle. So the Caribbean in that case would be important in terms of gaining different spots here and there as ports, especially as coaling stations. Back then, coal was a big mode of propulsion, and it ran out pretty quickly, so you had to have refueling station here and there. If a canal had to be built, say in Panama, to connect the east coast of the US to the west coast, it would have to be built by American hands. And so when a French company tried and failed to build a canal in Panama, Teddy Roosevelt insisted on intervening. In 1903, he arranged for a secession of that province, Panama, that used to be part of Colombia, so that they would become their own country and merely give over a chunk of their country to the US as the Panama Canal Zone. And then the United States proceeded in that zone to build a canal that opened in 1915. So that's clearly their national security interest, getting a canal in American hands. If you notice on the map, the main way to get to the canal from the US, from say New York, would be to go between Cuba and Haiti, what is called the Windward Passage. Not surprisingly, during the Spanish-American War, the US obtained the naval bases, the rights to a naval base in Cuba, what later became Guantanamo Bay, on one side of the Windward Passage. And in 1915, a year after the Panama Canal opened, the US invaded Haiti, thus getting access to a very important naval base at Môle Saint-Nicolas. So you guard the main access point to and from Panama. What about economic interest? And those play a role as well. If you look at the map of the US intervention in the Caribbean, you notice that a number of them are in Venezuela or in Mexico, specifically around Tampico and Veracruz. These are big oil-producing regions. Or in Cuba, where America had big sugar interests. Same thing in the Dominican Republic. Or maybe in Nicaragua, where the United States was also very involved economically speaking. So clearly there were economic interests. One of the key corporations in the area was something called the United Fruit Company. That would be the ancestor of things like chiquita bananas today. They began as a railroad company in Costa Rica, as I recall. And then from there branched out into acquiring land and then bananas, and that's how bananas became big business. By the late 19th century, you have steamships, so ships go faster, refrigeration, so it's now possible for the first time to pick bananas in tropical regions and rush them to a market in the United States ripe enough that they can be eaten by American customers. So that became a big export business, and pineapples and other tropical fruit. The United Fruit Company would invest heavily in Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, the whole region, and then really become the 800-pound gorilla in the neighborhood, to the point where these republics became known as the banana republics because they were so dominated by the United Fruit Company. Dominated in the sense that the United Fruit Company might control the main port, be the largest landowner, control the telegraph company, and really call the shots. To the point where if a local government tried to go against its interests, say by nationalizing the land of the United Fruit Company and try to distribute it to the peasants of Guatemala, which is what would later happen in 1954, then the United Fruit Company, with the help of the United States, might help topple the democratic president of Guatemala to set up a right-wing dictator that would be a bit more conducive to the interests of the United Fruit Company. So economic interest could lead to intervention. Generally, when presidents speak to the American people, they don't want to emphasize too much the economic interest because it sounds a bit crass. And you don't want to tell American parents, I'm sending your daughter or your son in harm's way just so that my fat cats of friends can make more money as dividends on the stocks that they held in an oil company. So usually you trumpet more things like national security or democracy, not so much economic interest. For that reason, there is one document that's really keen, would be one by Smedley D. Butler, who was an officer in the US Marine Corps and as such was involved in a lot of his interventions in the Caribbean in the early 20th century. Later in his career, he kind of saw the light and regretted plenty of the action that he had done. And in the 1930s, published a book called War is a Racket, in which he denounced a lot of the intervention that he had been in, and as an insider said, well, all those had been just about protecting the interests of US corporations, from Nicaragua to Haiti to Mexico. And because he was an insider and he spoke with such frankness, comparing himself to a racketeer for capitalism, to Al Capone, this was a document that would then be cited a lot by historians such as myself as evidence that maybe there was an economic interest in acquiring territories in the Caribbean. Andrew Carnegie, the American philanthropist, would have similar ideas on the matter. When he produced steel in the US, he became convinced that because the American industry was so good at producing a wide variety of goods, there might be an abundance of goods in the American markets, and because workers were not paid much in the Gilded Age, they might not have enough purchasing power to absorb all these goods. So you'd have a glut of products on the American markets that would put a downward pressure on prices. One solution, obviously, would have been to pay workers more above a subsistence wage. That's not what Carnegie had in mind. He thought if we have too many products, let's just dump them overseas, what he called the law of surplus. We have too many goods, so we need to have export markets, preferably in Latin America. So that region would not only play a role as a producer of raw materials like, say, bananas or oil, but other way also where you could dump your excess product. One American president who was really associated with that economic-driven aspect to policy would be William Howard Taft, who came after Teddy Roosevelt. He was a conservative Republican, very tied to business interests, intervened quite a lot as well in Latin America, specifically in Nicaragua, and often with economic goals in mind. Not too many people know much about William Howard Taft. He was only a one-term president wedged in between Roosevelt and Wilson, who are far more famous than he is. Usually when people remember him, it's because he was a very fat president and supposedly, according to the myth, got stuck in his bathtub because he was so fat. But in the context of Latin America, he was very active. His policy became known as the dollar diplomacy, in a way a diplomacy to pursue profits for the United States, but also using the dollar as a means of diplomacy. Instead of sending US Marines and such, maybe you could control a country through indirect means simply by taking over their finances, such as what was called the customs receivership. That means that you send a person from the National City Bank in New York to Nicaragua in charge of collecting customs import, which is the main source of revenue for the country. And then once you have that, you control the finances of the country. And just by threatening not to disperse the salary of parliament members, then you could force them to pass a law that you want. So it's a way to control a country not through weapons, but simply through the power of the almighty dollar. Which gives us an interesting point about the nature of American imperialism versus European imperialism, that it's more indirect and temporary. When the British came to India, they were hoping to control all of India and for eternity, if they could get away with it. Same thing with the French in Algeria or the Belgians in the Congo. When the United States intervened in the Caribbean, it was often in the hope of setting up a local government that would be friendly to US interests, and then the Marines would just remain as a legation guard, a bit more like a protectorate. And then if there was ever a president elected that was not conducive to US interests, then the Marines would come back, and you have a kind of a back and forth. You might call that a reluctant kind of imperialism that might be reflected the fact that Americans still did not like to think of themselves as imperialists. So what about the third goal of US policy in the region after economics and after national security? Well, it would be idealism. And this one is most associated with Woodrow Wilson, a president who came after Taft, 1913 to 21. He was a Democrat, very idealistic to the point of being self-righteous. You might know him in the context of World War I as a man who wanted to make the world safe for democracy. Well, before intervening in World War I, he cut his teeth in the Caribbean area, very active as interventions. He invaded Haiti in 1915, occupied the place for 19 years. Dominican Republic, 1916, that's an 8-year occupation, and also sent the US Army to chase Pancho Villa in northern Mexico during World War I, and also sent a US expedition to Tampico and Veracruz. There might have been national security and also economic interests at play there, but the way he presented it was mostly as an idealistic element. That when he saw Latin American republic, he saw unstable messes that could not somehow produce a stable democracy like in the US. So his goal was, quote, to teach them how to elect good men, to spread the light of American democracy. All of that was well-intentioned, but you could see how there's a bit of a condescending approach to it, that somehow you don't think that people in the Caribbean or Central America will get to democracy on their own. They need the guiding hand of America to teach them how to do good things. So it's a similar approach to what we've seen also in Asia and Africa, where people spoke of the white man's burden or the civilizing mission. So it's also connected in many ways to the racial prejudices of the era. Wilson was white, very much in tune with racial prejudices of his time. He actually restored racial segregation in the federal government when he became president. And when the very racist movie, A Birth of a Nation, came out, he had movie night in the White House to watch it. So that kind of transpired into the way he approached his policy towards Haiti, a country of mostly African descent, born of a slave revolt. It's clearly sending white Marines to Haiti to teach black Haitians how to set up a proper democracy. You see that attitude a lot as well in the kind of cartoon that would be published in the newspapers of the time. Just like today, the op-ed page would contain cartoons to illustrate current events, including the various US interventions in the Caribbean. And invariably, the American would be portrayed by Uncle Sam, a tall, reasonable, athletic man. And then all the Latin American Republic would be portrayed as much, much smaller, younger kids, disheveled, poorly dressed, their hair all over the place, with lips that are bulging, almost a racial caricature of an ape or a monkey. Unless they were following America's advice, in that case it would be nice and clean-cut, with nicely combed hair. So that gives you a sense of the worldview of American at that time regarding Latin America. So when did that period end? Well, largely in the 1920s and 30s. In part because the United States had intervened in World War I and not achieved much, and so you had an isolationist backlash during that period. And now there's also a sense of Latin America fatigue, that when it comes to Cuba or Nicaragua, the US intervened repeatedly, hopefully trying to set up a pro-American democracy and always somehow coming short. So the president of the 1920s and 30s decided, let's just step out and withdraw from those regions. In the 1920s, it means conservative Republican presidents, people like Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, and then by the 1930s, a president like Franklin D. Roosevelt. When he became president in 1933, he announced that he would pursue a policy of goodwill toward Latin America, what became known as the Good Neighbor Policy. This was formalized at the Montevideo conference that year when the US formally pledged not to invade Latin American countries, which seemed like obvious, not to invade your neighbors, but it had to be said based on the precedent of his previous presidents. And largely he held true to his word. Roosevelt ruled longer than any US president in the 20th century, and yet somehow is one of the few who never invaded a Latin American republic. So he's quite popular in Latin America for that reason. What else do you have in the Good Neighbor Policy? Well, you're still trying to sell goods to Latin America, especially when in World War II, the European markets were closed off by the Nazis. So you try to portray Latin Americans a bit better in movies, because you want to sell them movies. And quite a few movies from the 30s and 40s, whether from Walt Disney or Hollywood, tend to have Latin American themes. That trying to be nice to Latin Americans, but always somehow manage to offend people because they look a bit ridiculous today. Key stuff from that period would be Carmen Miranda, who originally was from Brazil and became a huge star in Hollywood, mostly for one kind of shtick, which was to do a musical number. Her numbers are quite delightful to look at. A lot of people for Halloween today will still dress like her, even though she's been dead for a while. It is a bit of a caricature of what Latin America is about. All about the bananas, apparently.
That song's for Johnny Smith, and he is very happy with the lady. Indeed, tutti frutti and
On the plus side, this period, the good neighbor policy would close a chapter of multiple US intervention in the Caribbean. It's not quite the end of the story because then the Cold War would pop up again, and then America would start intervening a lot, including in Cuba, but that's for another story. So that's it for the general overview of that topic. Next time we will have one case study when we will study US intervention in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. Stay tuned.